This program is brought to you by Emory University.
The beginnings of a professional baseball establishment, which was separate but equal to Major League Baseball, date from around 1920, when Andrew "Rube" Foster, owner of an African-American baseball team called the Chicago American Giants, convened a meeting in Kansas City with other owners of black baseball teams. Foster was a former star pitcher for various African-American baseball teams, such as the Texas Yellow Jackets, Chicago's Leland Giants, the Philadelphia Giants, and the Cuban Giants. I should say that during the early decades of the 20th century, many all-black baseball teams took the name Giants, which became, during the period, a kind of code word to distinguish black teams from white ones. Together, the owners of black baseball franchises in Chicago, Kansas City, Indianapolis, and Dayton, they agreed to fund the Negro National League. 2 years later, another 6 teams, the Brooklyn Royal Giants, the Atlantic City Baccarat Giants, the New York Lincoln Giants, the Baltimore Black Sox, the Cuban All-Stars, and the Hilldale, Pennsylvania Daisies, formed the companion and competing Eastern Colored League. For the next 20 years, players from these and other teams in the loose and frequently changing association called, in a reflection of the language of the times, the Negro Leagues, played each other during the regularly scheduled season, as well as white teams during barnstorming tours or on frequent exhibition games between white and black all-stars. Teams in the Negro League played typically about 200 games a year. Among the best teams in the Negro Leagues were the Kansas City Monarchs, the Homestead, Washington, D.C. Grays, and the Pittsburgh Crawfords. Some of the teams belonging to the Negro Leagues were as talented as their white counterparts, and many of the players rivaled the greatest stars of the game. They became legends in their own right. Josh Gibson, Oscar Charleston, Satchel Paige, John Lloyd, Smokey Joe Williams. You remember from a couple of weeks ago the great pitcher Smokey Joe Wood. Smokey Joe Williams would be his counterpart. And James "Cool Papa" Bell played the game as well as any player on any field. Their talents were known, even in an America still deeply divided by segregationist laws and attitudes. In fact, by 1940, Time, Life, the Saturday Evening Post, all popular magazines then, they had all published feature articles on Satchel Paige. Josh Gibson, meanwhile, was widely known as the Black Babe Ruth. As a child, I'd heard the story, never substantiated, that Josh Gibson was the only player ever to have hit a baseball out of the old Yankee Stadium, a feat of strength that was not even achieved by the Sultan of SWAT, Babe Ruth. How good were the Negro Leagues and the Negro League players? On the basis of available evidence, they must have been very, very good. Teams in the Negro Leagues played numerous exhibition games with professional white teams, both major league and minor league teams, as well as with semi-pro teams. Thus, a large part of the season for a Negro League team was spent touring, both in the U.S. as well as in Latin America and the Caribbean. Teams of black all-stars regularly played exhibition games with white MLB teams. Between 1887 and 1947, the black teams won 269 such exhibition games, losing 169. On the one hand, you could say these games don't compare the two groups of players fairly, because exhibition games don't really count for anything. On the other hand, however, you could say that both white and black teams would likely have taken those games very seriously. Both groups of men had something to prove to themselves and to spectators, and they likely would have played the games hard and played to win. Once they entered Major League Baseball, African-American players, many who had moved over from the Negro Leagues, quickly proved their abilities. Beginning in 1952 with Roy Campanella, the catcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers, African-Americans were awarded trophies as the most valuable players, the MVP trophy, for the National League for 6 years in a row. The Negro Leagues were where many stars and superstars of an integrated game first began to play professional baseball. Hank Aaron, Ernie Banks, Joe Black, Roy Campanella, Larry Doby, Elston Howard, Monty Irvin, Willie Mays, Don Newcombe, Satchel Paige, and Jackie Robinson all were ex-Negro League ballplayers. Jackie Robinson is celebrated as the first African American to play Major League Baseball, but the achievement of some of these others, like Black, Campanella, and Doby, ought to be remembered too. Larry Doby, for example, joined the Cleveland Indians in 1947, the same year Jackie Robinson took the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Doby was technically the second African American to play in modern major leagues. Doby didn't sign with the Indians until July 5, 1947, and took the field for the first time the next day in Comiskey Park as a pinch hitter. But his days as the first black player in the American League were every bit as difficult, not to say hazardous, as Robinson's. "Jackie got all the publicity for putting up with it," said Doby, "but it was the same thing I had to deal with. He was first, but the crap I took was just as bad. Nobody said, 'We're going to be nice to the second black.'" To date, 18 players who played exclusively in the Negro Leagues have entered baseball's Hall of Fame. The leagues provided enjoyment for baseball fans of all races. They provided African Americans economic opportunities they might not otherwise have had. And, while they existed, the Negro Leagues and their players doubtless made invaluable contributions to American life and culture. But the Negro Leagues were, like every other element of a culture based on apartheid, deeply wrong. They've been called a parallel world, almost a twilight shadow identity. In 2006, Buck O'Neill failed to receive the requisite 9 of 12 committee votes necessary for election to baseball's Hall of Fame. He was deeply disappointed. But the Hall of Fame, apparently in response to widespread criticism of their exclusion of O'Neill, in 2007 created for him the Lifetime Achievement Award, an award given to him, unfortunately posthumously, and afterwards given in his name no more than once every 3 years. So even though Buck O'Neill is not a member of the Hall of Fame, he has something better. You could say that baseball once again got it right after initially getting it wrong, as sometimes happens. Toward the end of his life, Buck O'Neill was asked about the demise of the Negro Leagues. In question, "How did you feel a few years after the majors integrated, when the Negro Leagues began to die?" And here's O'Neill's answer. "I welcomed the change, but the only thing I didn't like, in the Negro Leagues there were some 200 people with jobs. Now these people didn't have the jobs anymore. We eliminated those jobs. Still, I welcomed the change because this is what I've been thinking about since I was that high. Rube Foster was thinking about this before I was born, the change that would make it the American pastime. As to the demise of the Negro Leagues, it never should have been a Negro League. It shouldn't have been." Here are some relatively recent, from 2003, data on the number of African Americans currently in baseball. African Americans, these are quotes, African Americans comprise less than 3% of the 11 to 14-year-old youths who play on select teams, which are considered the highest level of baseball competition for those age categories. Less than 7% of NCAA Division I baseball players are African Americans. Of the players on the 2002 Major League rosters, 10% were African Americans, and that's the lowest percentage on National League and American League ball clubs since 1968. This is from an article by David Ogden, Joss versus Satch, Legends, Their Leveling Effect and Their Cultural Longevity. As for Major League Baseball overall, the numbers steadily declining. On opening day in 2012, only 8% of players were African American, down slightly from 2011, when 8.5% were African American. It seems as if each year sees a new historic low. For comparison, in 1959, when the Boston Red Sox added an African American to their roster, Boston was the last major league team to integrate, 17.25% of players were African American. In 1975, the number stood at 27%. So there has been a decline, and Major League Baseball is attempting to redress it.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.